For this tier list, I wanted to rank some of my favorite MTG content creators based on how likely I think they are to ruin a commander pod. Now, how does one ruin a pod? It's simple. If they play stacks, counter anything you do, blow up your lands, remove your commander, in fact, remove any permanent of yours, don't let you win even if they can stop you, play any cards that require you to pay 1 or 2, play free spells, wins via combo, wins with expensive cards, and so on. So, with the explanation out of the way, let's get into it.
First up is Amy the Amazonian. I was first introduced to them thanks to Loading Ready Run, and they seemed great. That was until I saw they played Xanathar Guild Kingpin in multiple EDH videos. But that commander will only ruin your pod sometimes, so I'm going to put them right in the middle. Next up is Andrea Mengucci. Pro player, he's also Italian, which means they're better than Canadians because of pizza. He also likes Pauper, which is the biggest green flag. Therefore, he probably wouldn't ruin your pod. Next up is Aspiring Spike, a modern aficionado who loves brewing decks just like me, and even took my tier list idea and is using it for modern content now. He's also a competitive player, so he would 100% ruin your pod. I mean, just look at that face. That's the face of someone who's hiding something. Next up is Attack on Cardboard. Now, this Australian YouTuber would 100% ruin your evening. I even have the Twitter DMs to prove it. However, I won't show them in fear of being cancelled in Australia. Also, he spells favorite wrong, which is just the biggest red flag, so we're going to put him right at the top here. Next up is Ben Wheeler. Now, he literally plays a deck called Ruin Your Evening, and as such would probably ruin your pod. Also, he's Canadian, but he did sign my Minskin Boo, so that was nice of him. Next up is Bosch and Roll, aka Brian Koval, a Legacy and Vintage All-Star, and I actually interviewed him on my podcast, which you should definitely check out. He loves CDH and Lone Pox and Legacy. Well, I think it's a Legacy deck. Anyways, because of this, I think he's likely to ruin your pod. Next up is Brian Kibler, former pro player, MTG Hall of Famer, and overall GOAT of hand shuffling. I mean, just look at that smile. He would never ruin your pod, he's way too nice. Next up is Cedric Phillips, a former pro player, writer, and caster for Pro Magic. They seem super nice and informative on streams, and they also have a podcast which you should check out. I'll have linked in the video description below. So honestly, I don't think they would ruin your pod. Next up is Mitch from the Commander's Quarters. He smiles way too much and is clearly hiding his power level and would 100% ruin your pod. Next is Convert Go Blue. He plays a lot of BO1 on Arena, like a lot. And based on that alone, I think he would ruin your pod, mostly to let out all that pent-up aggression after playing against aggro decks for 13 hours a day. Next is Krim. Next is Gavin Verhey, principal designer over at Magic the Gathering, and Pauper format panel member. They actually signed one of my playtest cards at MagicCons, which was really nice, and just based on that smile and how much they love the game, I don't think they would ruin your pod. Next up is Jim Davis. I love his 10 New Brew series as someone who enjoys brewing decks, and is also a pro player, and if any mean deck was the best, he would probably play it. Also, he would probably play CEDH, so he's pretty likely to ruin your pod. Next up is Jimmy Wong. He seems nice, we talked about bread on Twitter one time, and I really like his cookbook. So based on that alone, he probably wouldn't ruin his pod, however, he just might. So we're going to put him right in probably won't. Next up is Joey from EDH Rec. As a fellow graveyard simp, we understand how having our graveyard exiled would ruin our pod, so obviously, he wouldn't do that. Next up is Josh Lee Kwai. I've seen the decks he plays on game nights, and he just might ruin your pod. Next up is Kyle Hill. This stunning human being hit the gene lottery. I mean, look at that jawline. But he's also a CDH player, and because of that, he might just ruin your pod. Next up is LSV, Vintage Cube Master, Hall of Famer, and one of the hosts of Limited Resources. And if he played EDH, he would probably only play CEDH. Therefore, yes, he would ruin your pod. He also loves to generate blue combo decks in Cube, but still, he makes amazing content, which you should definitely check out. Next up is Mark Rosewater, head designer for Magic the Gathering. Look at that smile. He's really nice. He does a ton of great content, and I don't think he would ruin your pod. Next up is Marshall Sutcliffe. He's the other host of Limited Resources with LSV, loves Limited, basketball, and watches, which is such a wholesome group of hobbies. So yeah, probably wouldn't ruin your pod. Next up is Numot the Nummy. As a fellow bald man, I have to believe he wouldn't ruin your pod. Therefore, he won't. Also, he makes great informational content about drafting on MTG Arena, so go watch his stuff. Next up is Olivia Goldberg Hicks, co-host of The Commander at Home with Brian Kibler, and was or is on the Command Zone podcast. She seems super nice in all the videos I've seen, so she probably wouldn't ruin your pod. Next up is Paul Cheon. Paul is great. He signed my Colossal Dreadmount MagicCon and makes great draft content. They're still newer to YouTube, but have been putting out bangers, so probably wouldn't ruin your pod. Next up is Phil from MTG Goldfish, aka Brewer's Kitchen. No relation in the name, I came up with this all on my own, I swear. Phil's a Simic simp, and I don't blame him. He just wants to play his creatures and turn them sideways and draw a bunch of cards. So yeah, he would not ruin your evening at all. Next up is Pleasant Kenobi. He's British, he plays Warhammer, and he said my favorite commander was stupid one time in a video. He also probably likes tea, which is actually really gross. Therefore, he would 100% ruin your pod. Next up is Rachel Weeks. She's on the Command Zone podcast. I really like the videos she's in, and I don't think she would ruin your pod. Next up is Ristic Studies. Now they make some amazing content about the art and flavor of Magic, and honestly probably one of the best. However, they did release a video on Lantern Control not that long ago, so they're pretty likely to ruin your pod. Next up is Richard from MTG Goldfish. He's the one on the left-hand side. Now this man says to play board wipes over single targeted removal, but he also loves Abzan mid-range piles in Modern, so according to my math, that means he would likely not ruin your pod. He also likes birds, and I like birds. Next up is Surge from Loading Ready Run. Look at this absolutely handsome Canadian fella. He's the quintessential Canadian. Super nice and polite, which means he's clearly hiding something, but he can control it thanks to that maple syrup money, so he wouldn't ruin your pod. Next up is Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and he would likely ruin your pod because he's a known lover of Blood Moon and land destruction. So yeah, I'm gonna put him in right here in likely. Next up is Spice 8-Rack. They make amazing content talking about the lore of Magic. Also, their name is a reference to 8-Rack, which is a cool deck. And despite being British, I don't think they would ruin your pod. Next up is the Professor. He was actually an English professor. And what do professors do? Torment their students. Ergo, he would 100% ruin your pod. Next up is Tomer from MTG Goldfish. He's a Canadian, and as an American, I just inherently don't trust Canadians. However, Tomer does get killed first a lot in EDH, and as another player who finishes way too early, I respect the hustle. So he probably wouldn't ruin your pod. And finally, there's Voxy. Now, I met her once at MagicCon, and I had to tell her I had crabs in order to get a token. However, she was nice, so I did get the crab token. So, yeah, she would likely ruin your pod.
And that wraps up my content creator ranking. Now, as I said at the start of this video, this was intended as a joke, and doesn't reflect how I feel about any of these creators. They all do amazing things and work really hard, so make sure to check them out. Do you disagree with anything on my list? And what content creator do you want me to rate next? Let me know in the comment section below and give this video a like. Alrighty nerds, I'll see you next time.